To everyone. Today we're going to be talking about school and workplace recovery. Our schools are our workplaces for our teachers and our students. And what do we do? Finding a place to work and learn post-natural disasters. And clearly everything that we've been seeing in the news over the last 2 months with the hurricanes, the earthquake in Mexico, the wildfires in California, we're seeing significant disruptions. And what does that mean and what do we need to do? This is part of our 2017 Crisis Coach webinar series that we do with the Georgia Independent School Association. And you can either be listening today live in the broadcast, or maybe you're listening to it on demand at a later date. So as we think about these types of things, we'd like you to become our friend on social media. On Twitter, we're at Firestorm Soul. On Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. There is a hashtag for today's session. That's Crisis Coach. In fact, we monitor that regularly, so if there's something you want us to know, that's a good place to go. If you're in the webinar live and you have a question, you can use the toolbar up on the right. Firestorm transforms crisis into value, and our expertise are helping you to manage risk and crisis. Our expertise is in particular crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We're America's crisis coach, and we follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. We have attorneys just like everyone else, and they want us to have a disclaimer that, hey, this presentation isn't complete without the oral comments and discussions, and any work product from us must be viewed in terms of guidance from your local authorities and national and regional, as well as your personal legal counsel for your organization. And it shouldn't be considered as legal advice or legal opinion. So we've kept the attorneys happy, and you know it, so that works out well. Brought up the wrong slide deck, folks. Let me just change over to the correct slide deck, and then that way we'll be back. It's always exciting to have real live show business going on at the same time. And we will get us up to the right one. And I was about to talk about Tennessee, and I really should be talking about Georgia here, and that's the Georgia Independent School Association, and recent screenshot of recognition of some of the students and the impacts there. And we should be having Jeff Jackson with us, but I know he's out today working and helping some of our schools directly, but the Georgia Independent School Association has certainly made a difference in the state of Georgia, and is a great source of opportunities to learn. And I've met many of you at their events, and I know we've got one coming up in November. I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm the CEO, President of Firestorm. I also have on our Chief Intelligence Officer, Karen Mazzullo, and Karen will probably chime in at a couple of points as we go through and speak today. So we did a survey of organizations and looking at what they were concerned about, and this was a combination of schools and businesses. It was over 1,000 of them. And if you look, obviously the concern level associated around violence and terrorism, it was high, over a fourth there, if you had that 8 and 19%. Cyber attack remains a specific concern. I know that the Equifax events certainly have brought that reality back to everyone more and more. Brand and reputation, becoming known for whatever the crisis was in that area, becomes a key factor, and a loss of life event. About a fourth, and then we did this a number of months ago, so I think if we did it today, after Harvey and Irma and Maria and Nate, after the earthquakes in Mexico, after the wildfires in California, we probably find that 24% up significantly. But even as it is with these earlier numbers, 1 in 4, their number one concern was a natural event or a disaster. So if we think about that, let's start to think about what that would mean in the world of a school. And so if you look at the picture of this school, and it's from the C.E. King High School, and I don't think anybody's playing on that football field the day that this was shot or the week after it was shot. Think about the classrooms and the water in the classrooms and what this would mean in each of these areas and how the school would continue to operate. So I would like you to stop and think, this is not a picture of King High School. This is now a picture of your facility. What would you do if it was your school? And as we go through things today, I want to bring the attention to this, and we're going to try to bring it back on a personal level because it's going to impact your teachers, your students, their families, and your ability to have school. It's also going to become a factor related to the operation of your school. If you're not able to have classes, how are you going to handle remote learning? Is that a possibility? Do you have an alternative relationship with a place to go? If you're not going to have classes, are you going to be refunding tuition? Does your insurance cover that type of disruption? And how would you handle that funding that would needed to do that? So as you think through the webinars that you see, in every case, I'd like you to think about it, well, what would we do at our school if that was the case? Now, many times in our webinars, you'll hear us talking about things like behavioral risk threat assessment, identifying behaviors of concern before they escalate to violence. And I know that's a #1 concern that we have across schools all across the country. But if we think about these types of events, it leads us to a continuity of operations or a business continuity program. Your school is a business. How are you going to run that business if these things were starting to occur? Now, in addition to that, how has your plan been tested? Have you sat down and said, we're going to run a test. We're going to assume that our school isn't going to be where we're going to have classes this Friday. We're going to go to our backup school. We're going to go to a church and try to conduct it, or we're going to divide our students between multiple locations, or we're going to try to do e-learning or remote education around it. There are a couple of solutions, and we'll mention some as they go along. This picture that you see up on your screen is a crane that has crashed in Miami during the hurricane that was coming through, Irma. And having those plans, what you would do, how you would operate in a business environment became critical. But if the picture that you saw previously was your school, how you would operate becomes even more critical at that point. Here's an update from their superintendent, the damage assessment, and how long they anticipate to be out. So think about the impact of natural disasters have on a school exactly like you, because those things could have happened regardless of whether you're in a flood zone or if you were hit by a tornado. Those elements were coming and could come back together. So stopping and saying there are these reasons why our campus, why our school wouldn't be able to operate where we are. So how do we get back to school? How do we keep the learning process going? And that becomes the driving force. Now, you may be an executive director for your school or head of school. You could be on the school emergency response team. You could be the designated person that's involved in this. But how do you get the leadership, the board, and your head of school to focus on this particular problem? I think you're in a unique position today that you weren't in a few weeks or months ago. Those pictures are very fresh in everyone's mind. The pictures coming out of Puerto Rico are very vivid in association with that. The wildfire devastation in Northern California and the lost homes and lives that were impacted. So now is the time, because of that pressure, to make a difference. We did a webinar earlier today, and out of New York, and as we were going through it, Dan Perrin from Regis, and you'll see a little bit of information from them shortly, brought up the issue that right after Hurricane Sandy, everybody was aware, and then it started to fade away. I would tell you everybody's aware now, because when you look at Harvey, Irma, Maria, Nate, the wildfires, the earthquake, even the shootings in Las Vegas, the awareness level today is significantly higher than it was just a short time ago. So what I would encourage you to do, and where to start, is you have done a vulnerability analysis for your school, hazard impact analysis, hazard vulnerability analysis, and created a version of a hazard impact matrix. And if you don't have this, this is the type of thing that we can help your school do. and plan through it, you would look at the type of event. This is a spreadsheet. You'd list them down, and you divide them. These are man-made. These are natural disasters. And then what's the probability that it would likely occur? If you're in Georgia, you certainly aren't going to be spending a lot of time thinking about earthquake, although we have very minor earthquakes in Georgia on a regular basis. If you're in coastal Georgia, hurricane would be a fairly high probability because we've certainly seen it both last year with Matthew and the hurricanes this year. If you think about other things, that probability varies, but your focus then shifts over to the severity. How much lead time do we get? How long will it last? What's the impact on our people, on our property, on our ability to operate, our ability to be schooled? If you were at the highest levels of all of those things, the greatest impacts and the highest probability, your base risk level would be at 100%. Well, how can we mitigate that? Because we can't pick up our school and move it. Well, pre-action. What are you putting in place? Having plans, having backup sites, having thought about remote learning all come to the top of the table. What are your internal resources? What are your external resources? And those mitigation factors lower that base risk level to give you a risk index. So if it started out at 100, if you had all the things there in mitigation, it would probably drop you down to about 60% as a risk index. And from a planning perspective, anytime the risk index is over 40%, those are areas where you need to have plans in place, have put together what you need to do to have that event addressed and carried forward. If you need some assistance in this, if you'll reach out to us, either by listing a question or sending us an email, we'll get back with you. We'll try to reach out to everyone individually. So if we move beyond the hazard impact, now we've gotten it, we've got to divide our damages. We think about the damages to the physical structure. We saw the school that was underwater. The damage around it caused by people losing their incomes and jobs. What's going to happen to the families of your students? We've seen people move out of areas as a result of this. We've seen this happen to staff because if that was a teacher standing there, I don't know that that teacher is going to be going to work today or tomorrow. And on average, the outages could be 10 days to 2 weeks. In Puerto Rico, the outages are going to be significantly longer. So as you think about these things, they're very real and they can come into play. Now, the national impacts have really brought this attention forward. For Harvey was $3 billion. I believe that number has gone up. JP Morgan is now estimating 10 to 20 billion. Irma is probably an order of magnitude greater, 100 to 200 billion. And if you add the other events that are there, this will be one of the most severe hurricane years that we've ever had. The early estimates are going to multiply, and we see it. Here in Atlanta, we've already seen higher gasoline prices. We've seen businesses and schools impacted all across the region. Travel, I was surprised to see the photograph of planes in flight and how suddenly that was a much smaller number after Hurricane Irma for a few days in the southeast. If the roadways are lost, people can't get to school, and we're all going to see it in the grocery stores when we look at the increased food cost associated with it. So what happens if no one can get anywhere? It's great. Maybe we're able to open our school, but what happens if people can't get there? I don't think anyone's going to be coming along this road today. If I lived on the other side of the road, I wouldn't make it. I'm in Atlanta, as most of you know. If I can't get over the bridge over the Chattahoochee, as much as I would like to be able to get there, I won't be able to do it. I might have to drive away if the bridge went out. We were talking about the bridge a number of years ago up in Minnesota that collapsed. There wasn't even a storm, but the bridge failed. And so everyone that was living on the other side of town couldn't get to work because if they had to go a different route, it was over an hour of additional transportation. So these things happen. This is a picture from the hurricane last year that hit up in the Charleston area, and Karen shared it with us from that standpoint. But this is the environment we're going to be in. So you need to start now thinking about, if we can't do school where we are, what are we going to do here? Now, Woodsboro and their pride that's listed with their torn banner associated with it, we've got to then start thinking about what our alternative learning options are. The safety that we have at the other location, shelter, health, hygiene, and health. How are we going to feed our students at another location? How we do school. If we're going to do remote education, we're using in Firestorm a service called freeconferencecall.com. It's an ability to have a conference call that you don't have to pay for. Most everyone has unlimited cellular calling or voice over IP capabilities. And it includes even having a web meeting, not unlike what we're going through today with you in this webinar, where a teacher could set it up and run it and have a classroom where she could put the curriculum on the screen and a PowerPoint slide, or just show documents off her desktop or their desktop and step the class to keep them in place to do. Have you thought about it? Have you tested it? And how do those things work? But if we're having to go to an alternative location, do you have a memorandum of understanding with another school in your area or with a church or facility? And there are two levels of this to think about. Level one is it's just my building that got hit. The tornado hit my building. Or we've got an area-wide event, and as we're thinking about it, I'm assuming the people in these homes aren't going to be returning there soon, and they're certainly not going to be available to come to school associated with it. So when you look at the level of damage that you're seeing here, you look at the impacts that are associated with it, this is going to be a major disruption for your school year. And to think about now, what's going to happen to us financially, contractually, how are we going to relate to it? A good test would be find out who purchases insurance for your school and take your questions and your thoughts, have them put it in writing to the insurance broker that had sold the policies to the school, and ask them to explain, how does our insurance help us in the event that we had an episode like this with Hurricane Irma, or if we had a tornado that hits us? Step me through the process within it. Now, I mentioned Regis earlier, and Regis is a global company. They're headquartered out of Switzerland. I think they're run out of London, but they have thousands of locations around the world and over 1,000 in the U.S. where businesses go there. It's called dynamic recovery. If something happened to their location, you would move there to run your business. But think about the vendors. Who are the critical vendors for your school? Do they have a place and a plan in place? Because just the damage that we were showing that was happening to your school was exactly the same thing that would happen to them. And you'll notice that these percentages don't give you a warm fuzzy. It shows that most of them haven't demonstrated that they can do it, that they're going to provide only the minimums associated. They're not sharing the results. And less than a third have ever successfully recovered from a real disruption. So that means you're highly vulnerable in this process. Now, in a business environment, sometimes you see people go to recovery sites. It becomes a problem if it's too close. So if there's a church that you're saying is your recovery site and it's just down the road, likely the event that hit your school could likely hit that same facility. So you want to put some distance in it. Also, your recovery site, is it big enough? Can you, if you have 500 students, can you have 500 students there at that particular location? Or if it's so far away and they can't get there, that picture of the road disruption you will see. And I find it particularly startling, this 73% statement that Regis indicated, that after a disaster, when businesses choose to relocate to another area, almost 3/4 of them are concerned about security at that other location. Well, that certainly would apply to you in a school environment. At your current school, you may have a fence around your property. You may be able to lock the external doors to the school during the school day or lock the classrooms. When you go to an alternative facility, you may or may not have those same capabilities. So your level of physical security concern would make a difference. Also, public schools are faced with the concept that they may actually have students in the school as a recovery site. Maybe if you're going to an alternative facility, that church could also have those that are trying to get away from the problem too. So this access issue becomes extremely important. And when we think about physical security, there are three words that come to mind: access, awareness, and actions. The access is the controlling. That's why you have the fence and the locked doors and the control elements. The awareness, how do you know that it's been breached? The cameras and the alarms that would be in place. While you may have those at great levels in your primary location, but if something were to happen to your school and you had to go somewhere else, you need to think about how we would deal with it. And then finally, what are the actions that you want people to take? And if you've got questions about those, this is an area where a physical site security assessment would be good, not only of your primary campus, but your backup facility. Firestorm would be glad to work with you to get that to happen so that you would know and have those things identified before there was a problem instead of trying to scramble afterwards. So the points to consider, just like in any decision, any crisis, is what are the decisions we need to make? What are the actions we need to take? And what are the words that we need to say? And so we're going to focus on those as we go through. We're going to show you some checklists and some areas that make you think a little bit today to be able to start to do it. So you've got to look at what the vulnerabilities are, how you're going to run and operate schools, then that comes immediately into your plan and getting people to buy in. And again, I want to emphasize one more time, because of all the events we've been seeing in the news, I think you're going to find the level of buy-in is going to go up. And then you have to test your plans. You have to say, okay, we're going to take Thursday or Friday and do remote learning that day. And then let's see how it works and work the bugs out and make sure that we're aware. And our hope is that you never have to do that. But the first time to learn that you have a capability or to learn what the problems are isn't in the middle of a live crisis. So is remote learning for you feasible? What have you thought about? Whether you're at the Deweyville Elementary School, which looks like that pirate better be getting his ship by him fairly quickly, or the Joplin tornado picture of a school to the side. They're not holding classes in that building anytime soon after the picture was taken. Even the one on the left, you're going to have to be ripping things out. You're going to have mold and mildew. You're going to be experiencing a variety of issues that you're going to need to deal with. So how do we do remote learning? We're going to have to do it. Remote learning could be from home, or it could be at an alternative facility. So what do you need to start considering? If you had to do it, what are going to be the requirements? How will we operate if we've lost utilities and communications capabilities? You can't have school if you don't have running water, if you don't have toilets and sanitation. You could run the school for a little while if you had water, and even without lights, as long during the daylight hours, but certainly as we go into the winter and the evening comes up quicker, it would be a big difference. Have you tested it of what it would be like to run your school one day without electricity? By the way, we have found that if you remove electricity, it's like having a time machine going back 150 years in time. That'd be an interesting session for your students to get a feel for what it must have been like for individuals at the turn of the century, not the 2000 turn that they would think of, but in the 1900 time frame. So if you look at the late 1800s and the early 1900s, no electricity, how are you going to have school? And what happens if your school is housing hundreds of people? If you, for some reason, you become a shelter, then you're going to have individuals within it. So looking here, what are the people that we need on day 1 and day 2 and day 3 and 4 or 7? If you've done a continuity of operations plan, you've had a business impact analysis, and you know all of these, and it starts to tell you what your recovery requirements are. Now, Regis shared it with us, their list of types of questions for a business to ask, and I just ported those over directly because I think what we want to do is to think about them. Okay, what does this mean for me as a school? So look at the list and start to say, what does your list look like? How close are you to get people to that location? What size do you need? What's your budget? How much are you willing to budget toward this? You want a dedicated facility, or are you willing to share it? Is it physical and non-physical security needed? If you're in another location, you might need to have some security added associated. How do we get our mail? How do we handle those things? And is it reliable during an incident that we're going to be able to do? Now, I've mentioned this a couple of times, and I think this physical security element is one that shouldn't be just dismissed. If you're in a different location, you have a completely different set of risk factors associated with it to look at. So choosing that right location. So if you're saying, I'm going to go to this school and utilize their space, or and maybe we'll run a half day there, or we're going to go to these churches, so the elementary kids go there and the middle high and then the senior high go somewhere else. What are you going to do? How do you coordinate it? Where is that going to be? Or are we going to shift to remote learning for a week, 2 weeks, a month? How do we measure and how do we run? What are our staff requirements? And will they be reasonable to work in another location? One of the things that Regis has found in a business environment, people aren't willing to drive much further than they drove during their day job. And having that capability and understanding makes a difference. Are we going to pay them for the longer hours of the other involvement? How do we maintain security, as you've heard me say? And if people are going to work from home, if your teachers are going to try to set a remote learning, how does that impact your workers' compensation, your general liability and property insurance? All of those are things that your insurance broker could certainly help you with to better understand each of those elements associated with it. So there's a lot of things to consider as you're looking at those elements. And so what does your list look like from staff requirements? Again, if you did a continuity of operations or a business continuity plan, your business impact analysis would identify those requirements for you ahead of time. Let's see if I can get my computer to move to the next one. So confirming your numbers, seat and seat number requirements. Now we're thinking about not just your teachers, but your students. We're working with an offshore school that has a need of how they're going to have classes, and the head of school was saying, well, we'll just sit outside under the trees and we're going to do it for that period of time. Okay, how long can you do that? What is it going to mean? And what are your requirements over time, and do they change? And sanitation and toilets become a key factor, as well as the food and the shelter. By the way, if we had this problem, now we're having a very warm fall here in Atlanta and the state of Georgia. So outside may work for a while if it's not raining and high winds. But if we were doing this in January and February, being outside is certainly not going to make that work. And understanding what is needed to do that and the dependencies becomes extremely critical. So take the business list that Regis has been very kind to share with us, and saying, if we're going to do that in a business, what do we do here in our school? And also when we think about that, there's some technology requirements. Can we do this by setting up hotspots to run some IT from? People actually learned before we had computers and projectors in classrooms or TVs to show things on. How are we going to perform this? What systems do we need? How do we maintain control? Now, not every one of these technology solutions for remote learning are expensive. In fact, in today's environment, they're extremely reasonable. I mentioned the freeconferencecall.com gives you the chance to have a conference line that, if there is the ability to dial in, that people could dial into that phone, students could, and hear a teacher talk and give assignments and follow up. And they actually have a web conference capability, again at no cost, so that you could set up a web conference that 400 people could attend. It might even be a good way for the school to talk with all of your parents and explain this is what we're doing and how it's coming into place. And the beauty of it, again, is you've got power and internet access at no additional cost to your school. And then finally, regulatory requirements. By the way, you can see Regis is a global company because Organizations is spelled with an S and not a Z there. So it's good to have the education system kicking in at multiple points. But if we think about this, you have to have so many days in order to get for certification. And so what does that mean? How do we maintain security from an information and access and health and safety and privacy in those environments? So thinking about those now, having your checklist in place will make a very great difference. Now, when we're working in a disaster, if we're dealing with the type of events that we've been seeing on the television, it's not business as usual. It's not school as usual. It's school as unusual. Regis pointed out when they look at how, if they were helping people to start to think about it, think about what are the available locations. That's where you should start. I would draw concentric circles from where your school is currently located. Okay, what facilities are within a mile, 5 miles, and 10 miles in a radius from our location? Now, if you go only a mile away, if it's an area-wide event like flooding that could occur, that's probably impacted directly. If it's a single point event, the tornado hit our school, a mile away may well work. It depends upon the path and the area that was traveled. But I would start identifying those. Here's the ones in closer proximity, lumps a little further, and then at least go up and out. Recognizing the reluctance to drive a long way, if you're starting to get 30 or 40 miles, I don't think you're going to get the level of involvement at your alternative location. So think about it in that stair-stepping manner. And then in that location, is it already furnished? Do we need those things and do? Because if our school is destroyed, we're not bringing anything with us. The beauty of a church is that many of those would have a sanctuary for meetings or a social room or a kitchen for food, or at least preparing those areas, or they'd have classrooms that could be worked. And even if everybody doesn't have a normal chair in an area, you can find workarounds. And clearly, students can sit on the floor for a period of time to make it work. How are we going to handle internet and access? And if we're going to go to remote learning, testing that, and I would encourage you to test it once a quarter, where pick a day, and you would encourage a group of the school to do e-learning from home during that test, so you'd find out what worked well and what didn't work. And if you've got a backup facility, do you have access to it immediately? Clearly, those are all areas. And then we would recommend an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, in writing of what's going to happen with that location. And then, is this going to be shared with others, or do you have the exclusive with it? So in the aftermath of an event, America's done a great job of helping each other. Regis even offered free space within their areas to those businesses that were impacted by Hurricane Harvey. So I think that we recognize the severity levels of these things, and it's something that we need to have identified now and be ready for associated with it. And again, the awareness level is escalated. If this was a picture of your school, I'm thinking you're not having school this week or next week. Going in and ripping out the sheetrock, getting rid of the mold and mildew, making sure that the electricity and other services are in place make a difference. No one wants to think about a tragedy happening, and the hardest thing that Firestorm has to deal with is when the crisis impacts children. The phone calls that Dr. Steger had to make, he was the president of Virginia Tech, after the shootings there, to 32 families. It's an overwhelming thing to contemplate, having to call a family and say, your child is not coming home today. But thinking about these types of events, if the school is out of operations, that's a realistic fear factor. It's a realistic reality for a great many schools in Georgia and Florida and in Texas. Your school may be on higher ground, but it's going to affect your community and their ability to come to your location in these types of things. So thinking about them becomes critical. Now, Karen Mazzullo and her team have prepared a brief on this subject. It'll be some of the slides you've seen here and some of the tips and advices that you've been hearing within it. And I would encourage you to download it. It'll be up on the website next week. So you go to firestorm.com/briefs and you'll find it there. And you can give a link to this recording, or you can do a link to other recordings from other webinars, or get the briefs that we're talking about in each of these individual areas. The Georgia Independent School Association has committed itself to helping your school to be prepared, whether it's to be prepared for excellence, as in the picture that you see on the screen here, from the Jesuit High School and winning second place in the chess tournament, or it's something bad has happened. If something bad has happened, what are we going to do? Whether it's a behavior of concern, or a tornado hitting our facility, or a natural disaster like a flood or an earthquake. If you find yourself in a crisis of any level, I would encourage you to pick up the phone and call GISA. I've worked with Jeff and the other leaderships there through a variety of events that have happened to schools. Natural disasters are something that I think has probably been glossed over in many of our schools here in the state of Georgia. It's always something that's going to be happening to somebody else. Well, after the events from Irma and Harvey, Maria, Nate, the earthquakes, the wildfires in California, those events could happen to us. And if that's the case, are we ready? How do we know? And are we sure? If you've got questions about today's webinar, you can go to firestorm.com and send us a message. You can send us an email to webinars@firestorm.com, or you can pick up the phone and call us at 800-321-2219. Firestorm provides a service to every GISA member school, and that's to provide crisis management support in the first hour of your crisis at no cost. No cost to the GISA and no cost to your school. And the reason that's important is that when the disaster happens to you, when the crisis happens to you, to have someone that can help you go through that process. And our term for that is called crisis stop. Literally, how do we stop this crisis? And the first thing we try to do is to stabilize the events, help you understand what's happening, what are the resources that you would need to trigger those to make them available. Is that getting insurance involved, legal counsel, counselors for your people, to opine on what the consequences and the problems and obstacles that you would occur, and then finally to help you prevent the common crisis mistakes. Now, in this environment, the decisions that you make, the actions that you take, and the words that you say in the first hour will determine, is this crisis going to stabilize or is it going to escalate? And when you think about it and you view it in that way, it becomes extremely critical into your organization. So planning on it in advance will make a big difference, and I would encourage you to do that now. The Medicare and Medicaid are requiring now 17 different types of healthcare facilities to have emergency operations plans, to have identified their risk and vulnerabilities, to have plans in place, and to have crisis communications plans there, to do tabletop exercises as well as full simulations. If we're requiring it of our healthcare facilities, and by the way that they're gaining control to do that is they're telling them, we're not going to give you any more Medicare or Medicaid payments if you can't prove it. How much more important is it for us in our schools? So I think we've had a call to action as a result of the events that are out there. I think you can point to those, show them the pictures, and if you want to share this with your board, you want to share today's webinar with others in your school, it'll be a chance to bring this issue and make it personal. The time to prepare for this is now, not the time when the next storm comes together. We hopefully are moving toward the end of the hurricane season here. Theoretically, it ends as late as December, Very rare to have a November hurricane, but it can occur. But it might not be that. It could be a fire. It could be a chemical spill. It could be a violence episode. It could be a tornado. These events are happening. We know with a winter storm in the south, when it comes, it's going to snow or it's going to sleet or we'll have freezing rain, and we may close our school for a day or two, and the power company will get the utilities back up and running. And generally, it's not a disruption. But if it's your school that gets hit by the tornado, or your town, or your area, if it's your area that's impacted by a flood or some other significant event, it's not going to be school as usual. It's going to be school as unusual. That's what we wanted to talk about today. So hopefully you have some checklists, you have some insights and some things, and now have a motivation to carry it to the next level. Again, our thanks go out to the Georgia Independent School Association for underwriting this webinar series and to making this information available. If you need help, give us a call. We're there. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for everything you do in your school every day. That